to another night in the archive. Tonight, we will be going through my collection of tales and narrative poetry. Snow Wizard of Hearthvale. They said the snow in Hearthvale didn't simply fall. It chose its route, tasting the lamplight and adjusting its path for doorways where the doorbell chimed like a laugh. It threaded itself between chimneys as politely as a guest arriving late. In that city, a crest of streets cupped in a white bowl of mountains, winter had manners. It left crisp notes on windows. It softened the morning arguments of carts and hooves. It made space for voices to carry farther than they meant to, so that songs, like cooking smells, belonged to more people than the singer intended. That was before the snowfall thinned to a suggestion. Before the flakes lost their habit of landing and began to hesitate mid-air, uncertain whether they were wanted. Before the festival of falling light, the evening when every balcony hung lanterns and the valley returned them with stars, began to look like a memory rehearsing itself. Everyone had a theory. The miller blamed the new brass rails, too shiny for decent weather. The seamstress blamed zippers. The schoolboy blamed himself, as children will, because he had not whistled for the first snow this year the way his grandmother had taught him. Craftsmen shook their heads and said the air felt untuned, like a violin brought in from the cold and asked to play before it could warm its voice. No one said the name out loud, but it lived at the back of every sentence like a shadow. The Snow Wizard. He had once been a man of theater and tenderness, who coaxed frost into lace and taught icicles to sing in 4 parts. He brewed the first flurry of the season in a silver kettle and poured it from the cliff's lip in a shining stream. He lined the festival streets with a dusting that brightened boots and softened tempers. The old stories said he had a robe the color of moonlit linen and hair like a wing brushed with flour. They said you could learn kindness by watching the way he watched snow, because he watched it like an old friend arriving with good news and an appetite. And then, one winter, he simply stopped. Some said he left. Some said he retired to a cave lined with velvet stalactites. Some said wizards burn like fireworks and become the kind of glitter you can't sweep up. All wrong. He hadn't gone far at all. He had gone inside. Perched above the frozen lake where the wind made cursive of the ice, there was a restaurant called the Frosted Fig. Its windows were always fogged, the way warm windows are when soup is honest and a room understands itself. The Fig served comfort in courses, roasted roots with butter that believed in miracles, stews that forgave everything they touched, breads that sighed when you broke them open. The dining room was soft with napkins, and the kind of laughter that remembers to listen. In the corner by the largest window, facing the mountain's white shoulder, a table had been permanently set for Mr. Frostwick, an arrangement of chair, cushion, folded shawl, spoon that fit his thumb's curve, and a teapot with a crack in the glaze like a smile that knew better. He paid in tricks, the staff said, but never in bad ones. He charmed the drafts from the door, persuaded the fog to decorate the panes, taught the kettle to sing in the key of hunger. He tipped in well-made compliments, and sometimes in silver buttons that grew cold if you lied. The wizard was not the needle of a man he had been in the old posters. He had become a comforted cliff, layers and folds, a belly like a loaf fresh from the oven, cheeks like 2 blushing apples that had decided to winter indoors. His robe was exchanged for a jacket that buttoned heroically, then surrendered. His spectacles magnified the world with forgiveness. He ate. He ate because the world had been very loud, and soup asked fewer questions. He ate because he remembered nights on the mountain when a single mouthful of heat had been a hymn. He ate because somewhere along the way, giving had grown heavy, and he confused fullness with being filled. On the night our story begins, the night before the festival of falling light, when the city rehearsed its brightness, a child pushed through the fig's door carrying a paper parcel tied with bakery twine. Junie, the baker's apprentice from Thimble Row, had an errand and the attractive irresponsibility of children who have not learned to be shy with legends. Delivery, she announced, which is the kind of word that makes a restaurant's heart stand at attention. For Mr. Frostwick, said the maitre d', already unwrapping the warmth. The cinnamon lace pudding. Junie looked at the table in the corner and then at the man behind it, who was demolishing a hill of potatoes as if digging out a road. His napkin was tucked into his collar like a small sail hopeful for wind. His fork had perfect manners. His eyes held the kind of kindness that has gone very quiet from not being asked to speak. "Sir," Junie said, "my hands are cold. If I give you the parcel, will you make them warm?" The wizard paused, fork mid-sky. No one had asked him for a spell in years. The city had long since learned not to beg from someone who might be hiding from that very thing. He set down his fork, put out both hands, and Junie placed her fists in his palms. His hands were not theatrical. They were working hands that remembered how to coax weather into being. Warmth rose through her fingers like tea through a cup. She made a sensible little sound that only children and people who've been honest for a long time make. "Thank you," she said. "Also, why doesn't it snow anymore?" The question sat on the table between the salt and the bread like a guest who had arrived without a coat and yet belonged. "Because I haven't asked it to," he said, surprising himself. The words came straight out of the place where regret keeps a tidy drawer. "Because I took my warmth and kept it. I forgot how to turn it outward." Junie considered this with lethal seriousness. "The baker says the ovens give more when we open them," she offered. "If we never open them, the dough is just dough, not bread." He smiled a little, and something in his chest felt the light, awkward step of a creature waking and shaking breadcrumbs from its fur. "What's your name?" he asked. "Juniper Clementine Tamsin Jones," she said with the confidence of a contract, "but I answer to Junie." "Junie," he said. "The snow is shy. It wants to fall for those who want it. I've been hiding in a room that never asks the sky for anything." "Then ask," she said, as if asking were the sort of thing one did between courses. "Please, tomorrow is the festival. We hung an orange on the tree for you in case you come to see." He looked at the window. The mountain edged the sky like a page with a margin. A frosting of old snow lay in the gullies, but nothing new moved. A tear he had not filled with pudding found his eye. "I will try," he said, and in Hearthvale try is a promise. The maitre d' brought the cinnamon lace pudding, which arrived in its dish like a small holiday prepared to be believed. Mr. Frostwick ate it slowly and tasted, through sugar, the first year he had made snow. A kettle of moonlight, a pinch of laughter, a ladle of breath from a choir of unpracticed voices. He slept at his table, as he usually did, with a spoon under his cheek like a lucky charm. He dreamed the way old conjurers dream, of work done correctly, and woke before anyone else, in the hour when kitchens think their first thoughts. The frosted fig held its breath while the lamps blinked away. The lake below wore a fine coat of quiet. The wizard stood. He pulled on the robe that had not fit for a long time. It did not fit now. He did not apologize to it. He put on boots that had to agree to the negotiation of his new geography. He wrapped a scarf around his throat, not because he needed it, but because affection prefers gestures. The maitre d' stepped from the kitchen doorway as if from a proscenium. "Shall I pack provisions?" he asked. "Please," said the wizard. "A heel of bread, a thermos with whatever the fig believes in this morning. And for the way back, "If I do this correctly," said the wizard, "the way back will be downhill." He left by the back door, where the snow took measure of him and decided to be kind. The restaurant sat on a ledge above the silver lake, a sheet of ice written in script and smudged by wind. The path rose from the ledge into the white ward, the high alleys where the mountain kept its rearrangeable streets. There were rules up there, walls that shifted 3 inches to the left when no one looked, steps that appeared when praised, railings that preferred gloved hands. Hearthvale had made a habit of talking to stone until stone became a little polite. "Snow," he said to the path, "I have hoarded my warmth and it has made me heavy. I need to give again." The snow shivered in the way of blankets when someone shares them. He climbed. His breath drew little signatures. The mountain took his measure and answered by making the trail firm. He passed Lantern Key, where street lamps wore caps and collars of frost, and where a pair of strangers, neighbors surely and yet shy about it, stood shoulder to shoulder under a single light as if trying on a conversation. They were sharing a paper cup of broth. Each took a sip and offered it back with both hands, the way holy things are handed. "Tell me a rule," he said to the lamp. "Always share the first steam," said the lamp, and breathed out a ribbon of warm light that did not sting his eyes. He passed Thimble Row, where Junie's bakery windows were fogged with plans. The boy, sweeping the step, pushed a little heat into the open air every time he opened the door and let it spill like gold onto the snow. The wizard stopped to absorb the manners of this act. He tucked the knowledge into the place where his spells learned vocabulary. "Tell me a rule," he said to the broom. "Pause before the threshold and give a small warmth to no one in particular," said the broom, in the dry whisper of straw that has heard weather. He climbed the sighing stairs, which complained decorously with each tread, and the coal-cloth alley, where old laundry lines bowed with icicles that chimed in minor keys. At Button Square, a woman knelt to tie a ribbon around a stray dog's neck, a ridiculous ribbon, red and too large. The dog allowed it with pride. The woman laughed in a responsible way that did not alarm the dog. "Tell me a rule," he said to the ribbon. "Make strangers look ridiculous only with kindness," it said, floating to his hand so he could feel the weave, then floating back down, remembering its job. Up he went, appetite breathing in his ear like a friend with bad ideas. He rested at Soup's End, the corner where 3 houses accepted, in rotation, the duty of keeping a pot on. Today the door was blue, and the pot contained a courage that smelled faintly of dill. "Sir," said the woman ladily, who recognized legends because the city had taught her how, "your bowl." He refused, then accepted, because refusing is its own kind of pride, and he had been proud long enough. The soup entered him like sensible advice, whispered in the warm bit of the day. "Tell me a rule," he said to the spoon. "Stir counterclockwise when you want to call the past," the spoon replied, "and clockwise when you want to calm it." The peak came into view, the spire of whispers, a white finger pointing not at the sky but through it, to the place where light and cold marry and produce weather. The wind at that altitude carried conversations it had not been invited to. It made a low harp of the pines. Every story the city had told itself drifted past. He heard, "I shouldn't have said that. We've got one more blanket. Take it. Save the last roll for Ms. Veller. He won't like this ribbon, but I do. He'll come around. Open the door. The sky wants to smell the stew." At the foot of the spire stood 3 markers of polished black stone. On the first, be generous. On the second, be gentle. On the third, be warm. Below the words, in smaller script, scratched by hands that had wanted to be remembered. When in doubt, repeat. He rested his palm on the first. The stone held a temperature that remembered bodies. He rested his cheek on the second. The stone gave back a low hum, the way good floorboards do. He sat with his back to the third, and the mountain moved just enough to make him comfortable, without permitting sloth. "Snow," he said, "I have a confession." The wind calmed, not because he commanded it, but because the mountain liked confessions that yielded work. "I ate the way lonely men eat. I took my hunger and hid it under flavors. I wrapped myself in comfort and forgot that comfort is a verb when it's beautiful. I made a small hearth of myself and sat too close to it. The city needed winter and I gave it stew." His words froze lightly in the air and tinked to the ground. He heard them in miniature, like bells on the hem of a costume that had not been worn in a long time. "I have carried warmth inside me like winter stores," he said. "And warmth hoarded is not warmth, only weight. Snow is only warmth turned inside out. Teach me how to turn." The spire answered the way mountains do, by pretending to be silent and then not being silent at all. The wind gathered itself into the snow chorus, not voices, but a harmony built from breath, pine, tea steam, the sigh of a bread loaf cooling in a clean kitchen, the first laugh after a long argument, the feet of dancers deciding to try again. It spoke not with words, but with methods. He felt them enter him as instructions. Begin with offering, continue with attention, finish with debt paid forward. He opened the thermos. The fig had sent citrus broth, the color of the sun reconsidering its options. Steam rose and mixed with cold until the border between them went to pieces. He took one sip and poured the rest onto the spire's stone. The steam drifted up, made a small warm cloud, and the wind accepted it the way old friends accept a borrowed coat. He removed his robe and laid it on the rock. He unbuttoned his patient jacket and laid it beside the robe. He took off his woolen scarf with the jam stain that had persisted through several laundries and shook it once for memory, then placed it with the others. He stood in his shirt, which had become, through years of good dinners, less a garment than a story about appetite. "This," he told the sky, "is what I will give. I will give my comfort." He set his hands on his belly, as one might hold a loaf to be shared. He closed his eyes and turned his warmth outward, not as heat, but as welcome. He remembered every time he had been fed and not asked to explain himself. He remembered the maître d' saving the spoon he liked. He remembered a woman once putting her coat around his shoulders while he arranged a frost for her daughter's wedding. He remembered Junie's small fists trusting his palms, and the way the snow used to step forward when called as if it had been waiting all along. "Snow is only warmth turned inside out," he said, and he turned. The world obeyed like a guest who had been waiting at the threshold, shoes snow-dusted, petition in pocket. It began in his chest, a brightness like the first lick of flame on a new wick, a breath that lengthened of its own accord. Warmth spilled from him not downward but up, unknowing of gravity, and the air learned it the way a crowd learns a refrain. The warmth cooled as it rose, not by losing itself but by finding a new shape. Flakes budded from it, first timid, as if reading the room, then brave. They took forms not of identical stars, but of gifts given. A flake in the pattern of two hands meeting. A flake like a door opening inward. A flake like soup steam crowned with dill. A flake like ribbon tied on a dog. A flake like Junie's mitten. A flake like a spoon set down after being satisfied. A flake like a window fogged by singing. They spun into the wind, and the wind spun them into weather. They traveled the map of his city, down the sighing stairs, through Coalcloth Alley, across Lantern Quay, over Thimble Row. Wherever they landed, the air remembered how to be welcoming. Lamps glowed not brighter, but truer, which is better. Soup tasted more like rescuing. Bread adopted the warmth of a long hug. People lifted their faces and felt familiar, as if the sky had said their names the way a friend does, without rehearsing. The wizard sank to his knees and laughed in the clean manner of men who have finally asked and been answered. The spire was bright, but not with fire. It glowed with the satisfaction of competence. Down in Hearthvale, children began to shout the polite version of shouting that Snow earns. Doors opened in a row, like the flipping pages of a pop-up book. The baker threw open both halves of his door, and the heat leapt like a dog that does not doubt it will be forgiven. Junie ran out without her hat, realized it, ran back for it, and ran out again. She held her hands up as if to catch a letter from a far country. "It's our Snow," she told the street. He remembered. People laughed, the way punctuation softens a sentence. They brought blankets to their steps, not because they were cold, but because sitting outside and belonging is better in blankets. Someone put a chair on a balcony and lifted a mug in the direction of the fig, where a certain table sat empty save for a folded napkin and a note scrawled on the back of an old menu. "Junie, thank you. A warm meal was the spell I'd forgotten." BF. At the restaurant, the maître d' read the note, and then, because good restaurants keep promises, he set a bowl of stew on the wizard's table anyway, just in case legends get hungry later. The windows, fogged by the work of morning, clarified and took stock of the weather. They seemed to lean, just slightly, toward the snow. Up on the mountain, the wizard gathered his robe and scarf with new affection for old fabric. He put on what he needed and left what he did not, a habit he decided to practice Fridays as well as holidays. He descended by a path that had remembered to be merciful. The flakes coasted around him, like students escorting a favorite teacher down the steps after a concert. By the time he reached Lantern Quay, the city had organized itself into celebration without being told. Lanterns appeared in windows with a confidence that suggested they had put themselves there. The festival of falling light began ahead of schedule because no one wanted to wait. The mountain approved. On Thimble Row, Junie had hung an orange from a ribbon as promised. She was standing beneath it as if her skull were a tree not yet done with fruit. When she saw him, she did not bow in any reverential manner. She ran at him and collided with his middle like a small meteor of gratitude. "You asked," she said, muffled by wool. "You asked and it listened." "I listened first," he said, and it felt exactly like telling the truth. The festival grew itself the way yeast makes a living of air. People lit lanterns and the snow liked them and learned the streets in a hurry. Music made itself available. Strangers fell into step. The valley below answered with stars that did not need permission. It was not spectacular. It was complete. They gathered by the frozen lake where the wind drew cursive on the ice and then corrected its own typos. The city, warm in its coats, faced outward and upward, like a congregation that has decided the sky is, at very least, interesting. The snow wizard climbed the low stone steps to the little platform, where announcements were made about not blocking the fire lanes and about where to find the good cider. He cleared his throat, and the mountain courteously reduced its wind by a degree. "I have eaten," he said, "and I have eaten wrongly. I ate my warmth and did not share it. I mistook being full for being of use. I'm sorry." The crowd murmured its appreciation for an apology framed in the grammar of adults. He smiled at Junie, who was trying not to step on her own excitement. "Snow," he said, "to the city and to the weather and to the old stories, is only warmth turned inside out. You have turned it today, each of you. The lamps at Lantern Key, the ribbon at Button Square, the soup at Soup's End, the bakery door opening to spill its heat on no one in particular. You have made the spell. I only remembered it." He lifted his hand, and a last flurry, small and ceremonial, drifted over the gathering like a sentence settling into its period. It was not an applause-seeking snow. It was the snow that visits when the baking's done, and the house decides to boast a little to the street. Flakes landed on hats and sleeves. They landed on cheeks and did not sting. They landed on the orange, hanging by its ribbon, and framed it like an ornament that had returned to the tree after an adventure. "Tomorrow," he said, "and the day after, and the season after that, I will keep asking. But the asking must be ours. Keep a pot on, share a steam. Sit by a door and let the warm out in little pieces. Speak to the mountain like it is a friend you feed. When in doubt," he added, smiling at the memory of the stones, "repeat." He did not stay to be congratulated, because congratulations are a fragile dish, and winter is a busy kitchen. He walked the streets until the lamps bowed toward sleep, until the city had eaten its fill of joy and wrapped the leftovers in waxed paper with someone else's name on them. He returned to the frosted fig, where his table glowed as if it had its own opinion. He set his hand on the spoon he loved and then left it there, because spoons have always known what to do and require little supervision. In the days that followed, Hearthvale relearned the manners of cold. People shook snow from their coats outside, and then shook off the day inside. Children stood by the bakery door to catch the warm fog and call it dragon's breath. Dogs learned to accept ridiculous ribbons with dignity. The festival of falling light did not end. It widened, like a garment let out at the seams to fit new laughter. The mayor wrote a proclamation in her neatest hand that said nothing about policy and everything about practice. Be generous, be gentle, be warm. When in doubt, repeat. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, a robust man in a flour-dusted apron would step into the fig's kitchen and introduce himself as Barth. He made an acceptable stew and an exceptional sauce for cinnamon lace pudding. He taught the kettle to sing a better key. He declined to be paid, then accepted a bowl of soup and called it even. At first, Snow the next year, a child, Junie, taller, stood at the lake's edge and whistled the note her grandmother had taught her. The mountains considered the pitch and nodded. Snow arrived with its old confidence. It found lanterns waiting and kitchens opening. It knew the streets by name. It saw the wizard peeking from the alley with his apron on and his hair scolding the wind, and fell a little harder on his shoulders. Not as scolding, but as affection. The city lifted its face and kept it lifted, because some weathers deserve to be looked in the eye. And when anyone asked years later how the spell worked, they told the story correctly, of the snow wizard who had eaten too well and remembered better, of a child's request that opened a door, of a mountain with polite steps and a spire that accepted soup, of 3 rules carved in stone and then rewritten in steam on kitchen windows. They told it like this: snow is only warm turned inside out. They had already rolled away the carpets when the snow arrived, as if the weather meant to cross a polished floor before any of the customers could change their minds. The city breathed fog into the evening. Street lamps wore halos and silvermans, which had meant Christmas longer than anyone could argue. shone with the dignified bravery of a dancer bowing after her last performance. Inside, the great bronze doors yawned to greet the late stragglers of the last holiday sale, while the revolving entrance turned with ceremonious patience, ferrying families like music notes into warm light. Ribbons lay quiet in boxes. The perfume counter exhaled a memory of violets. High above, a starburst chandelier considered the hour and gave nothing away, because in grand spaces time is always a well-dressed rumor. Clara Vale worked in displays and devotions. That was the secret title she gave the job when no one was listening. Officially, she was the junior window dresser hired after Thanksgiving to help close the place down with a flourish. Unofficially, she believed the city's heartbeat behind glass. Every afternoon, she pressed her palm to the cool panes along Winter Avenue and felt the slow pulse of stories. Noses imprinting brief constellations on the outside, hands arranging wonder on the inside, glass holding the breath between them like a promise. Tonight, the windows were flawless, 12 in a glittering row, each its own cinema. Carousels turning like sugar moons, velvet trains in snowfall, a ballroom of toy ballerinas suspended mid-pirouette. The crowd moved from pane to pane, and if they looked carefully, they could see themselves reflected as split seconds of Christmas. A grandfather's hat becoming a crown as the lights caught it. A child's mitten lifted like a small flag. A young couple reviewing their faces for evidence of a future. And there, in the middle of the line, the seventh window. A blank square of frost-whitened glass, boarded on the inside for decades, a bit of sadness interrupting the pageantry. 7 is unlucky, said Maisie from hosiery, not unkindly as she passed Clara, with a box of last-size stockings. A pity they never fixed it. Something happened there, back when the city wore gloves. What happened? Clara asked. She liked facts, but she loved rumors that sounded well-tailored. No one agrees, Maisie said, which is an answer that keeps a good rumor fed. They say the glass filmed over during a snowstorm, and when they wiped it, there was a city on the other side, but not ours. Some say the mannequin stepped down and kept walking. Some say a boy left his handprint and it never melted. Clara laughed, because she didn't know yet how to take such things seriously. She was 22, with sleeves rolled past the wrist, and a pencil behind her ear, the way her grandmother, who had made theater costumes when sequins were still honest, used to wear chalk. In the display workshop upstairs, she had found a box of her grandmother's old glass pins and the satin tape measure she'd used to corset dreams. She tucked both into her apron as if they were permission slips. It pleased her to imagine a lineage of women who had dressed stories and watched them step into the light. Snow whispered itself louder. The throng thinned. Managers made speeches that were precisely as moving as such speeches are meant to be. There were pastries that tasted of nostalgia and sugar, and a punch that pretended not to be punch. Somewhere a choir of school children tuned, then found the note, then held it, and it moved through the store like a polite cat weaving between ankles. 10 minutes, called Mr. Ainsworth, who managed the floor with the serene alarm of a ship's captain guiding a ballroom through a squall. Then the sweep and lock, added Mrs. Ross from haberdashery, gathering neckties like a bouquet of polite water. Clara tied the last bow in the toy window and checked the tilt of a rocking horse's shadow. She could do this. Precision, warmth, a curtain line converted to glass. She adjusted a little painted drum so it faced the sidewalk squarely, the way an honest heart faces winter. Then she turned to number 7, the blank pane, and stood to listen. The snow made the smallest sound against it, like a gloved finger tracing a letter. Tomorrow, she told the window, though she didn't know what promise she had just made. When the lights lowered, the store released its company with courtly ease. Families drifted out under the marquee, hats tilted against the fine snow. The revolving door admitted the last laugh and exhaled it to the street. Someone called, "Merry Christmas," not to anyone in particular, but to the air, which in good cities is rarely empty. Then the keys turned with the ceremonial gravity appropriate to what was being kept safe. The night guard, Len, made his rounds, a man of ordinary heroism and extraordinary pockets, which contained peppermints and patience. "Take your time," he told Clara when she asked for one more walk. "I'll swing back." She moved down the line, alone with the windows, as one is alone with an orchestra between movements. The toy window waited, bright with small anticipations. The jewelry window breathed in tiny sparks. The travel window, trunks, postcards, paper ships seemed to lean slightly toward the glass, the way a listener leans toward a story. And number 7, a square of pale breath. "Glass remembers what hands forget," her grandmother had said, pinning a hem with the accuracy of weather. "That's why we keep returning to it." Clara stood where the viewers had stood all evening. She saw herself layered on the snow like a neatly folded thought. Beyond her reflected face lay only frost, yet something in that frost had a direction, as if it were not simply cold, but intention. The pattern coursed outward like script she could almost read. She lifted the monogrammed handkerchief she used for polishing and cleaned a circle the size of a saucer. Behind the fog she saw the faintest movement. No, not a movement. A quiet rearrangement of stillness. The frosted pane took a breath and clarified to a pale, moonlit translucence, the way water loses its worry when it decides to freeze. And in that sudden clearness, the boarded interior dissolved, and there, where a blank had been, opened the suggestion of a street she did not know. Clara did not step forward. She merely leaned, the way a song leans into its refrain, and for a moment the cold inside the glass felt warmer than the air against her cheek. "Len," she called softly, not because she was afraid, but because it seemed polite to tell someone when the world changed its mind. But Len was somewhere upstairs, unlocking a door for a remembered coat, and the store had chosen privacy for this part. The frost articulated itself into filigree, the lovely white lace that ran in threads across the pane, and in the heart of the lace appeared a scene so fine it trembled. The toy window, but not the one she had just arranged. This was a toy window from another winter. Here the drummer was painted differently. The rocking horse wore a crooked star on its saddle, and a child's mitten sat on the ledge as if it had been set there the moment the picture was captured. The mitten glowed a little, as though it had not forgotten the hand it had once instructed where to go. Clara's throat did a small, undecorated thing. Her eyes watered in that particular way sentimental people pretend is caused by drafts. She thought of hands and glass and the rumor of number 7, the idea that certain windows do not look onto sidewalks, but onto memory. She pressed her palm to the pane out of habit and vow. The glass yielded, not in the sense of breaking, but in the sense of breath. Her hand passed through and found the coolness of another air. It was a dignified air that knew better than to be windy. It had manners. She looked left and right, and then, with the ceremony of a reader turning a beautiful page, leaned in and stepped through. The sound changed, but only slightly. The difference between being in the audience and being in the wings. She was standing exactly where a window dresser should not be, in the display behind the glass. The miniature snow fell at a considerate rate. Toys held their poses with professional pride. and on the ledge, just as it had appeared, the mitten waited, a child's red knit, one pearl button at the cuff, a single pulled thread catching light. "Hello," Clara said, to no one and to everything. It felt correct to introduce oneself to a scene like this. "I'm here to look after you." From somewhere in the white hush came a voice. Not a voice the way people make them, but the voice of a chorus stored in wood and ribbon, and the small resolve of fine stitches. "We belong to those who stand on the sidewalk," it said, but without sadness. "Tonight we also belong to you." "I don't know what to do," Clara confessed, and it was a relief. The mitten's pearl button blinked. It looked like an eye at the very moment before tears. "You do," said the chorus. "You always have. Find the thread. Window 7 is empty. It cannot remember unless we lend it the pieces. Take this." The mitten grew heavier in her hand, not a weight precisely, but a consequence. When she turned it over, a sliver of silver thread revealed itself, stitched so subtly along the hem that it might have been part of the cuff all along. It trailed toward the back of the set, where the cardboard skyline met velvet snow. Clara followed the thread. It looped around a tin bell, slid through the hollow of a carved flute, and vanished beneath a block tower that had been carefully stacked and just as carefully not knocked down. She knelt. The tower whispered, "Thank you for not ruining it." And underneath, coiled like a bookmark in a beloved volume, lay the first thread, a kindness. She knew it without anyone telling her. It felt like the warmth of a stranger holding a door. It looked like light that had decided to be patient. She lifted it. It gleamed. The chorus rustled approval. "One," they said. She slipped back through the glass, mitten in one pocket, thread on her wrist. On the street side, number 7 glowed faintly, and along its inner edge, where the boards had never truly been, a small pattern appeared, a boy's mitten resting on stone, red as a remembered berry. The image trembled, then steadied. The blank had accepted its first stitch. Len's footsteps approached, the sensible rhythm of a man who tried not to interrupt miracles unless asked. Clara turned. He paused. They regarded each other in the language of late-night accomplices. "Find something?" he asked. "A kindness," she said, and didn't try to explain more. He nodded anyway, because certain answers satisfy even without understanding. They moved to the next window together, as if walking an aisle where no officiant was required. The jewelry window wore winter light like a crown. Rings sat in velvet. A necklace lay like a sentence waiting for its verb. Brooches regarded the world with patient sparkle. Clara stepped behind the pane as easily as putting on a coat. Here the hush held a different tone. It was not the quiet of toys between games, but the hush of promises rehearsing themselves. She ran a finger down a display card and felt the pulse of yeses spoken in department stores across decades. Small, brave yeses with grocery lists in their pockets. "The second thread?" she asked. A mannequin in ivory nodded. The nod was almost human, and yet decidedly not. These were not people pretending to be still. They were stillness remembering people. The mannequin lifted a glass lid from a ring box and revealed, instead of a ring, a coil of silver thread wound through tiny folded letters. The letters were no larger than fingernails, but the script was crisp and sure. Clara held one to the light and read, "I have not always known how to keep a promise, so I am making a smaller one that I can carry. I will hold your name nicely in my mouth and not throw it when I'm angry. I will leave the light on, not as a trick to make you come back, but so the house can see itself." There were others. She did not pry. The thread ran through them like a spine. She gathered it gently, not breaking any loose. It warmed as she wound it in her palm. "This is a promise," said the hush. Len, looking through from the street side, lifted his chin in question. Clara nodded. In number 7, a second image appeared, faint as some music you only hear when the kettle is about to sing. 2 hands resting on a counter, the space between them the exact size of trust. They went to the travel window last. Here were trunks with stickers from places that were really stickers from the idea of places. There were postcards painted by hands that had never stood on those shores, and yet had managed to reproduce them in inks that remembered salt air. There was a train done in green enamel that seemed to hum not with movement, but with the rumor of it. Clara entered and felt the sensation of putting on a coat cut for another century. The air carried departures softened by the decades until even the goodbyes were gentle. "I don't like endings," she said under her breath, and the set, overhearing, rearranged itself by half an inch to make room for the honesty. A leather satchel sat open on the top of a trunk. Inside, under tissue, she found a coil of thread wound through a ticket that had never been torn. The destination read, "Home," in letters ambitious enough to apply to anyone. Around the ticket, someone had looped a ribbon that could have been part of a hat or a sleeve. It smelled like starch and winter, and the underside of a clean collar. When she touched it, she felt the kind of ache that does not wound but instructs. "A farewell," she said softly. The chorus of sets, wood, velvet, paper, enamel, breathed assent. "3," they said. Clara stepped out to the sidewalk. The city's night was listening. Snow spelled love letters in a language both complicated and clear. Len waited at number 7 with the respectful anxiety of a man about to watch someone else's magic. "Be careful," he said. It was a blessing, not a rule. Clara placed her palm on the 7th window, and it opened like a book to the chapter an old reader most needs. Inside it was not blank anymore, but pale, like a sheet half drawn onto a bed. She went through. Number 7 held nothing and everything. The afterglow of 1,000 faces, the dry perfume of tissue paper, a hush full of footsteps not yet taken. It was the feeling of a store 5 minutes before opening when hope already has its coat on. She lifted the threads. Kindness, promise, farewell. They trembled as if they too could see the frost lacing the edges of the glass. "How?" she asked. And if the store had shoulders, it would have shrugged. How is the wrong question at certain hours? She thought of her grandmother's hands, how they had threaded beauty into bodies without anyone noticing where the seam began or ended. She thought of the phrase the older dressers said when something fit impossibly well, "It lies right." She took the 3 silver threads and began to stitch, not into fabric, but into the air itself. With each stitch, the pale seam gathered density. First appeared a city street in snowfall, the bright awnings, the bright eyes, a child lifted to see a carousel of mechanical deer. Then emerged the inside of the store. Lipstick testers lined up like soldiers with better priorities. A pianist in a bow tie commanding carols from keys that had learned all the words. Then faces, not distinct, but unmistakable in their tender business. Someone choosing this pair of gloves instead of that, because of a wrist bone that wanted to be admired. Someone laughing into a scarf because laughter sometimes requires a hiding place. Clara stitched steadily, tears falling in that unalarming way they do when work becomes prayer. The kindness thread embroidered glow into ordinary actions. A stranger straightening a fallen hat. A clerk slipping a peppermint to a child. who needed a reason to behave 3 more minutes. The promise thread bound hand to hand and hand to counter. It ran along price tags and turned them into vows to take care of what you bring home. The farewell thread wove the exits not as endings, but as continuations. People going out into a more possible city, people carrying packages like temporary lanterns. When she tied the last knot, number 7 was no longer a blank. It was the store itself, as remembered by those who had loved it. The glass held the shape of 100 holidays at once. If you looked quickly, you saw only light. If you lingered, you saw an era learning how to say thank you. There remained one space in the border, a small emptiness the size and shape of a child's hand. Clara hesitated. The mitten still warmed her pocket. She took it out and set it gently on the sill inside the window, palm open to the city. "Glass remembers what hands forget," she said aloud, and number 7 brightened so subtly that only the attentive would have noticed. Len, attentive, noticed. He exhaled the sort of breath you keep for weddings and first goals. "What now?" "Now it keeps," she said. "Whatever is given to it." They stood a time together, the kind of time that doesn't consult clocks. Dawn began long before the sun made it official. The snow took on a pearl sheen. The street lamps made their last declarations. The baker across the way switched on a light and tried a door with muscle memory. The city would soon stir its instruments and play morning. "It'll be wrecker crews today," Len said, apologetic as if he'd invited them. "Orders from the board. They want the sign down before the year turns." Clara looked at the windows. She had dressed them to be looked at. She had not dressed them to be destroyed. And yet, even in endings, there is ceremony. "Let them try," she said. The crews arrived with good boots and practiced caution. They were not villains. They were men who did their jobs with the flavor of coffee still on their tongues. The foreman raised a hand. Len unlocked the doors for the last time and stood aside with a dignity he had not borrowed from anyone. The men entered. The first pane they set their tools to was number 1, out of respect for sequence. It detached politely and lay in padded canvas, a great eye convinced to close. At number 7, the foreman frowned. "Boarded behind," he said, checking the paperwork. "Old stuff." He lifted his tool. The glass regarded him without malice. He tapped the corner with the delicacy of a man waking a friend. The pane did not crack. He pressed in the center, the way a doctor tests a rib cage. The glass did not complain. He nodded to the crew, and together they set the suction cups and pulled. Gnome 7 did not move. It was not stubborn. It was complete. "Again," he said, and again they pulled, and again the pain remained a thought that refused to be rephrased. The foreman stepped back, not angry, but suddenly tired, as if facing a wall of his own childhood, one he could not go through, not because it was closed to him, but because it had already done its work. "Leave it," he decided, practicality dressed as mercy. "We'll take it last." They took the others. They took the sign. They took the counter stools, the velvet ropes, the registers that totaled not only money, but also the size of women opening handbags. Number 7 stayed. Clara waited all day without sitting, the way certain kinds of love make standing very easy. People gathered as they will for street theater and goodbyes. They whispered rumors and promises and the offers strangers make to one another in the presence of history. A small boy pressed both hands to number 7, and then took them back shyly, as if he had startled the glass. His palms left fog prints that didn't vanish. They took their place among other faint ovals, years of greetings layered like onion skin. At 4, the foreman returned with a specialist wearing the confidence of men who understand materials. He examined the pane and then, unexpectedly, took off his cap as if in church. "It isn't glass," he said. "Not anymore." "What is it?" asked no one and everyone. "Kept promises," he said, and put his cap back on, because the day was cold, and the answer felt too exposed without it. Evening leaned in. The wreckers gave up, not in defeat, but in recognition. Some things do not dismantle, they release. They left number 7 to the street. Len locked the doors. The store, relieved of its furniture, exhaled like a house after a party. Not sad, only quiet, in a way that included gratitude. Clara stood where she had stood the night before, where she had stood as a girl with her nose to the glass, where she would stand someday as a woman with someone else's mitten tucked in her pocket. No. 7 glowed with a warmth it had borrowed and then improved. On its sill lay the red mitten, a single pearl button bright as a star, with the discipline to be small. "You'll be all right," she told the city, and meant it. Snow powdered the shoulders of strangers and made them kin. Someone began to hum the melody of a song that had not been fashionable in a long time, and yet everyone knew the second line. Someone else laughed, the laugh that makes other laughs believe in themselves. People touched their pockets and found, without knowing how, that each contained a sliver of silver thread, too short to stitch with, perfect for tying around a story so it won't go missing. In the months that followed, when the building became something else, smaller shops, a cafe that served honesty in mugs, a florist who knew how to tie bows without bruising ribbon, number 7 remained as a panel of light at street level. Children treated it like a letterbox, slipping drawings under the frame to see if the window would keep them safe. It did. Brides stood there for photographs and looked more like themselves. A widower stopped every Thursday to polish a handprint that might have been his, might have been anyone's, which is one reason it mattered. At Christmas, the florist hung a garland around the pane and stuck a card in the greens, in memory of what was given. Sometimes, late, when the shops had shut like well-behaved books, Clara walked past on her way home. She would slow in front of number 7 and touch the glass with 2 fingers. It was cool, but not cold. Behind it, the stitched city shifted very slightly, the way a sleeping body does when it recognizes a friendly voice. "Glass remembers what hands forget," she would say. But hands remember too. And because certain windows offer back what you tell them, a reflection would nod, and the red mitten on the sill would glow for an instant, not brighter, just more surely. And the thread on her wrist would give a small, companionable tug. On the first Christmas after the reopening, the neighborhood hosted a modest lantern walk. Children carried paper lights in the shapes of stars and trains and impossible birds. Parents walked as if the night were practicing being kind. At the corner near number 7, the procession paused, not to pray and not to perform. They simply stood in the light and let it know they were there. The florist stepped forward and placed a single pearly button on the sill beside the mitten. It rolled once and found its still place. Clara joined the back of the crowd and watched the scene she had stitched continue to stitch itself. An old man lifted his cap to the window as if to a friend in a balcony. A girl studied her face and found it worthy. Len, in a new coat that fit him like a decision he had finally made, passed peppermints down the line to anyone whose mouth needed a punctuation mark. The lanterns moved on, bleeding warmth into the ordinary dark. Number 7 did not dim. It didn't need to. It had learned something buildings rarely learn and people learn only sometimes: how to be bright without asking for attention. It had discovered how to keep what was given until the giver returned to claim it, or until the city by degrees, became ready to carry it again. On some nights, if the snow had the right manners and the street kept its voice low, you could stand before the pane and see a faint embroidery of scenes deepen and clarify. The toy window's drum, the jewelry window's patient clasp, the travel window's untorn ticket marked home. Between them ran 3 silvery threads, so fine they might have been cracks if you did not know better. But you did. The city had made sure of that. And if, while you stood there, you lifted your hand to the glass, the pane did not open. Important things remain in their places, but it did something almost as generous. It remembered the temperature of your palm, kept it, and returned it to you as recollected warmth when you lowered your arm again and turned toward whatever life outside the window had arranged for you that night. Clara went on dressing windows in other streets, other seasons. She learned new palettes, new crowds. Yet without fail, in the bottom right corner of her plans, she penciled a tiny red mitten as if to bless the composition with a memory of belonging. Clients never noticed. That was fine. Blessings work whether anyone names them. Years later, when a child asked how windows knew what to show at Christmas, she said, "They don't, we do." And when the child frowned, skeptical but willing, she added, "Glass remembers what hands forget, so we try to give it good things to keep." The child considered this with the furrowed brow of philosophers and people deciding between 2 flavors of ice cream. Then she pressed both hands to the nearest pane in a double greeting and squealed at the flowers inside, as if surprised the world had thought to put color in so many places. There is no ending to such stories, only a soft insistence. The pane stands. The mitten keeps its post. The threads hold. Snow rehearses its choreography and performs it beautifully. People forget and remember and forget again, which is how remembering grows strong enough to survive a century. And every winter, somewhere along a row of windows where fresh fingerprints bloom and vanish, somebody says the old phrase aloud, the way a pianist touches a familiar chord before playing the new song. Glass remembers what hands forget. And in the curve of those words, if you happen to linger, you can hear the tables being set in every warm room of the city. Gifts being wrapped with the small economies of love. Quiet farewells practiced with grace and the steady beat of time. They said the winter light in all the streets could read a face like a book and never told what it learned. On Christmas Eve, snow fell with the modesty of someone arriving late to a party and trying not to interrupt. The town had finished its errands. Shops closed their eyelids. Ovens took a breath, and every chimney wrote a short note to the sky in cursive smoke. Nina sat on the front steps with her chin on her knees, watching the snowfall make the telephone wires hum. She liked to listen for the part where the world went quiet, but didn't stop. It was the year she had grown just tall enough to reach the top cupboard by standing on the good chair. It was also the year her grandfather had thinned down to the light inside his eyes, which were the color of blue glass marbles found at the back of a drawer. He had been a sign painter once, before the town decided it preferred plastic to patience. Now, he painted for only one customer, the past, and the past never hurried him. He came out with a long bundle wrapped in a quilt that had retired from bed service. The bundle smelled like pine sap and attic dust, like the inside of an old story. He set it on the steps between them and patted the quilt as if it had caught a cold. "I thought you might be ready," he said. "For what?" Nina asked, although she loved the kind of question that didn't need an answer yet. "For snow the way it used to be," he said, and unwrapped the bundle. A wooden sled lay there, polished to a soft shine, with runners that curled like question marks. Along the rails, under the varnish, scenes had been painted as tiny as postage stamps, but clear as a window, a forest of peppermint pines, a market where icicles hung like wind chimes, a lake with a skin of blue glass, a street much like theirs, but all the doors wore ribbons tied like bows that had learned to breathe. Your grandmother called it the winter route, he said. We used to take it when the night wanted to be longer than we did. Is it? Nina began, and then stopped. At 12, she was learning that the most important part of a question was the space you left for the answer to arrive. It goes where it's painted to, he said, and where it's needed to. You steer by listening. He touched the side rail where a tiny sled was painted inside the painting, like a joke left by a careful carver. Beneath that, in the smallest lettering the hand could bear, a message had been brushed. For gifts that know their names. Her grandfather's knuckles were as knobby as draw pulls. He rested the sled on the snow. The runners sighed, happy to be remembered. Nina put on her wool hat that smelled faintly of cinnamon from the kitchen and slid the sled a little with her boot. It moved as if the ground were already prepared to let it pass. Take Emil, her grandfather said. 2 sets of eyes can find twice as much sky. Emil, her cousin from the next street over, arrived with his usual momentum, cheeks pink from the cold, and a grin that could unstick a window. He carried a thermos, 2 mittens not precisely matching, and the kind of optimism that ignores instructions and arrives anyway. When he saw the sled, he whistled through his teeth. That's not a sled, he said. That's a promise. They hauled it to the top of Alder and sat in the pocket where the hill kept a view of the church roof and the park pond and the bakery's lit windows. The sled's rails were cool and smooth under Nina's hands. The painted scenes seemed to be waking from a nap. The peppermint forest rustled, the ice market chimed, the blue lake held a breath. She thought she heard, faint as a secret kept by snowflakes, a whisper, ready. Nina looked at Emil, and he nodded like someone saying yes to the right kind of dare. They pushed with their boots. The sled slid forward, found the groove of the hill, and then found something else. The glimmer between snow and picture, where paint becomes path. The world tilted gently, as if embarrassed to have kept this from them for so long, and the street blurred into brush strokes. The sled did not fall. It entered. The sled knew where it was going, even if Nina did not. Peppermint pines. They came into a forest that smelled like cookies cooling on an invisible counter. The trees were tall and banded red and white, not like candy so much as like music, with stripes that seemed to ring if you looked at them with the right kind of attention. Snow sat on the branches with excellent manners. The air was colder than the town's, but not unfriendly. A small deer with cinnamon stick antlers trotted out and stood in their way. It lifted one hoof and set it down, as if tapping the measure. We're not lost, Nina told it, and the deer blinked, which in deer language is either everything or nothing. Emil held out a mitten. The deer sniffed and then tugged with its mouth at the cuff until it slipped free, leaving Emil with one bare hand and a startled laugh. The deer hung the mitten on a low branch and pointed its nose down a path where the trees leaned together to make a hallway. The sled eased forward, humming a little tune. Around them, birds made of sugar glass hopped in the drifts, making the smallest crisp sounds. Nina thought of all the times in school she had tried to be quiet enough to hear what silence wanted. Here, silence spoke in many pieces. Hums, clicks, small sweet sighs, and none of it asked them to leave. They came into a clearing where a bench sat under a tree with ribbons tied to it. Ribbons the color of winter berries and scarves forgotten on a friend's chair. A little sign hung from the bench. In letters not much bigger than grains of rice, it said, "For resting and remembering." Emil flopped onto the bench and took out the thermos. "I brought cocoa," he said. It made a poor sound in the cup, like a shy river, but steam rose with authority. Nina cupped her hands around it. On the sleigh rail, the tiny scene of the peppermint forest brightened as if to watch them. "Remembering what?" Emil asked, because the world was full of signs, and he liked to check for fine print. Nina thought of her grandfather's hands, adjusting the sled, as if untangling a necklace. She thought of how he had said we used to take it, the we that included someone who was no longer here. She thought of the smell of hand soap and pine wreaths in their hallway, and the way her grandmother's humming still lived in the quiet corners of upstairs rooms. "Maybe it's for remembering people with the same warmth as the cocoa," she said. Emil lifted the cup. "To the ones who taught us how to make snow angels that look like they'll get up any minute," he said. They drank. The cocoa tasted like bedtime and bravery. When they finished, Nina noticed something at the foot of the bench. A small package wrapped in paper printed with blue stars tied with twine. It had not been there before. On the tag, someone had written, in that small painter's hand, "For Mrs. Bell at the corner shop." Nina's heart made the sound a mitten makes when you find it at the back of a drawer. "The sled is showing us gifts," she said. "Or is it that the world is?" Emil weighed the present in his hands. It felt like a bar of something solid with rounded corners. "Mrs. Bell loves to wrap other people's gifts," he said, "but I never see her open any." He tucked the package into his coat. The deer tapped its hoof again, and the forest's hallway brightened, making a path where none had been. "Thank you," Nina said to the deer, who bowed with such courtesy that the snowflakes on its back did not fall. They pushed off, and the peppermint trees chimed softly as if wishing them good luck, in a language you learn as a child, and forget until some Christmas when the world remembers you first. The ice market. The sled slid out of the pines and onto a street strung with paper garlands and laughter. Stalls lined both sides, their roofs white with responsible snow. Here, people sold things that didn't quite exist in the usual way. Jars of warm pockets of last summer, scarves knit from the scent of fresh bread, biscuits that tasted like the last page of your favorite book. A woman in a hat shaped like a star traded in weather for picnics. A man with a coat full of pockets presented handshakes you could borrow for difficult introductions. "Do we need money?" Emil whispered, because even in a dream, commerce asks for manners. "Maybe we need the kind you can only make by talking," Nina said, which seemed to please the stall-keeper nearest them, who slid forward with a tray of snowballs that glowed faintly from within. "Winter light," she said, "for windows that face the early evening. Good for sewing up gloomy corners." Nina took one in both hands. It gave off a steady glow, like the memory of a friend's kitchen. "How do we pay?" The woman looked at the sled, then at their faces. "With a story about a kindness that didn't think it was one," she said. Emil told how their neighbor, Mr. Lanning, had cleared the sidewalk for the whole block because he couldn't sleep and his boots were right there. How he'd left before anyone could say thanks. The woman nodded, satisfied, and tucked 3 small snowballs into a paper bag as if handing them a recipe. "One for you, one for the house that taught him, and one to keep in your pocket until June, when everybody could use a little frost." They moved on. A stall covered in lace icicles sold maps to shortcuts between people who had forgotten how to talk to each other. Another offered pencils that wrote in the color of whatever you were brave enough to imagine. A boy exchanged a song for a spool of string that remembered how to be unknotted. Near the end of the row, a quiet stand burned with a blue knot fire that didn't melt anything. The woman behind it, cheeks rosy from a lifetime outdoors, had boxes of ornaments that were only the hooks, with the instruction, hang a wish here. The wish will decorate itself. Nina bought 2 hooks with the story of the time her mother drove home the long way because Nina had fallen asleep, and the streetlights were playing a good song on the car roof. Emil bought one with a coin he carried in his sock, ever since he'd found it under a bench on a day he needed luck, and the woman smiled as if recognizing the currency. At the market's end, under an arch of spruce, the sled slowed of its own will and turned right, as if following a thread. They came to a stall and seemed almost embarrassed to be there. It sold small boxes no bigger than matchbooks, each labeled with a word. Courage, patience, first, hello, I'm sorry. The proprietor, a man with a scarf knitted in the shape of a smile, nodded to them. One each, he said softly, as if not to wake a sleeping child. No charge today. Nina chose first hello. Emil took courage, but looked like he might trade it for second breakfast if given the chance. The man tucked I'm sorry into Nina's mitten without explanation. As they turned to go, he added a 4th box to Emil's pocket, so lightly Emil didn't feel it. Later, when he found it, it would say, I forgive you. But for now, the sled understood and did not narrate the future out loud. They left the market with a bag of winterlight, 3 ornament hooks for wishes, and boxes of small bravery that clicked softly together like honest teeth. On the rail, the painted market changed. Where there had been a blank space on a table, there was now a little package wrapped in paper with blue stars, tied with twine, the twin of Mrs. Bell's. Nina touched it and felt a little zing, as if a gift had recognized its name. The sled is mapping the gifts, she said. Or the world is. Both, Emil said, who liked answers that allowed more than one truth to be true at once. The sled knew where it was going, even if Nina did not. The frozen lake of wishes. They came out onto a lake so clear, it seemed to be a sky the town had set down to rest. Under the ice, reeds signed their names to the season. A fisherman sat on a stool in the polite middle of things. Lines dropped through neat holes. The sled carved a fishtail of soft snow and stopped at the edge where the ice took to being a floor. Do we skate? Emil asked, eyeing his boots. The laces had learned his impatience and tied themselves loosely. We walk, Nina said, and the ice held them the way a good story holds a restless thought. The air nipped but didn't bite. The fisherman raised a hand in greeting without looking away from the water's afterthoughts. At the near shore, a child was kneeling with a small brush and a jar of something that looked like melted midnight. He was painting tiny stars on the surface, each no bigger than a coin. As they watched, one of the stars blinked, not like a trick of eyes, but like acknowledgement. Hello, Nina said, and her box of first hello warmed in her pocket as if grateful to be put to use. The boy looked up, eyes quick as sparrows. They last until morning, he said. Longer if the sky remembers them. Some nights it does. Some nights it's busy. Can we help? Emil said. The boy considered and handed them each a brush. The jar of midnight held more night than it should have, but nobody complained. They knelt and painted stars that were also small promises, to wash dishes without being asked, to call a friend back, to laugh at the right time, to forgive someone who had mistaken quiet for consent. Under Nina's brush, a star formed that looked, if you squinted, like the shape of her grandfather's steady hand. Wish lights, the boy said. You have to paint the ones you'll keep. What's your name? Emil asked. dabbing a star that would probably by morning be a little messy and very sincere. "Emile," the boy said, and then at their surprise, smiled. "It happens. I'm the Emile from a street that runs next to yours in a town that only appears after snow. But names like to meet themselves now and then. It keeps the letters from getting lonely." Emile blinked, pleased that the world had chosen to be more complicated in a generous way. Nina felt her box of first hello flutter in her pocket, and before she could say "nice to meet me," the sled rustled as if clearing its throat. On the rail, the painted lake scene had changed. In the corner, by a painted shoreline, a painted star had appeared. So tiny, so clearly viewed. It shimmered and then became a small envelope taped to the sled's side in the real world. Inside was a paper ribbon cut in the shape of a door. "For later," the other Emile said, as if he had known it would appear. "Some doors don't open outward. Sometimes you give them a shape to encourage them." He picked up his jar and tapped the brush gently on the rim, like a lullaby for bristles. The route goes on. "Do we say goodbye?" Nina asked, hating to leave anybody who painted stars on thin ice with such care. "You say see you in the morning sky," Emile said. "So the night has something to do." They crossed back to the sled. The fisherman pulled up a small silver fish and looked at it as if checking a list. "Holiday orders," he said mildly, and let it go. The sled sniffed the breeze, which smelled like peppermint pines, and someone baking something with nutmeg, and slid toward the edge where the lake put down its mirror. The sled knew where it was going, even if Nina did not. Deliveries. The painted rails glowed. Market, forest, lake. And now their own street. A miniature alder with roofs like folded envelopes. The sled turned toward a lane Nina didn't recognize until she did. The one behind the corner shop where Mrs. Bell kept boxes of ribbons and a jar of buttons that had lost their jackets. Her window was lit. Inside, she stood at the counter ironing tissue paper with the careful heat of someone doing math with feelings. Nina knocked with the gentleness you use on a door that has always been kind to you. Mrs. Bell peered out and smiled, the sort of smile people make when the person on the step belongs in the scene, even if they hadn't been expecting one. Emile handed over the star-wrapped package. For a second, the world seemed to draw a breath with them. Mrs. Bell untied the twine and opened the box. Inside lay a paper envelope tied with red thread. She blinked. Nina leaned in. The envelope held photographs. Not glossy, not framed, just pictures in the color of kitchen light, all featuring Mrs. Bell's hands, wrapping, tying, smoothing, placing, giving. "I never show up in Christmas pictures," she said softly. A laugh caught in her throat, like a good secret. "But here I am." She placed the envelope against her chest, like a warm roll fresh from the oven. "You dear children, and what a beautiful sled." They left her at the counter, holding her hands in photographs, as if greeting old friends. The sled was already nosing toward Marshall Avenue, where Mr. Lanning's porch had 2 shovels, but only 1 set of footprints. The bag of winter light rustled. Nina climbed the steps and wedged 1 glowing snowball into the metal bracket that held the porch lamp. The light didn't change color. It changed mood, which is better. On the rail, the painted house acquired a soft glow that said to any passerby, "There is room here for your chilly ears and your long day." They carried courage to the crossing guard, who'd never once in 30 years taken a day off. He opened the matchbox and found a pair of skates the size of dimes. "Ah," he said, with a sigh from the era when the pond had been busier than television. In the morning, he would lace up real skates and wobble exactly once before remembering. But they didn't know that yet. The route did. They tucked First Hello into a mailbox that belonged to neighbors, who waved, but never stopped long enough for names. They hung the wish hooks on the tree outside the bakery, and the tree decorated itself in sentences that made people slow down. I miss you. Let's try again. The cocoa is on the house, if you're having a hard day. People walking by reached up and added their breath to the branches, and the ornaments brightened as if light could be fed like soup. At the school custodian's house, they left the little "I'm sorry" with a note that said, "For the day, we didn't stack the chairs." At the music teacher's, they left a small wrapped whistle that sounded only the pitch of laughter. At the quiet house on Willow that had stayed too quiet all autumn, they hung a hook, and the wish decorated itself with a tiny bell in the shape of an open door. The sled seemed to relax, as if the world had stuck its landing. Nina felt the rail warm under her palm, the way a cat warms a windowsill and pretends it has always been this way. She and Emile looked at each other and grinned the kind of grin that doesn't ask for proof. "Is that all?" Emile asked, and of course it wasn't. The rails brightened again. The painted alder street swelled a little, as if taking a breath before singing. Their own house, tiny and neat, shone on the sled's side with a new detail, the ribbon-shaped door. Nina touched her pocket. The paper ribbon warmed against her hand, exactly the temperature of someone taking yours in the cold. "Home," she said, and the sled agreed with relief and enthusiasm, which is a very good combination. The sled knew where it was going, even if Nina did not. The door-shaped ribbon. Their living room was a collage of quiet joy when they crept in, tree lights going about their work without fanfare, 2 mugs on the low table, a book face down at the place where someone had fallen asleep honestly. Their grandfather had dozed in his chair, a blanket across his knees, mouth slightly open in the way of men who trust that the world will keep the rest of the watch. The house smelled of oranges and pine, and the kind of bread that makes a crust you can hear. Nina unfolded the paper ribbon, and it made the soft sound of paper, deciding it is more than paper. On the back, in tiny brush script, was written, "For a door that forgot how to open on holidays." She looked at the front door. It was a good door, solid, a little stubborn in damp weather. It had been locked more lately, not by key, but by habit. The kind that arrives after a year of being careful. "Do we tape it on?" Emile whispered, as if not to wake the grown-ups or the door. Nina nodded. She stuck the ribbon at elbow height, the way you'd fasten a corsage, and stepped back. Nothing happened spectacularly. The door did not bow or glow, or swing on its hinges. It simply felt different, the way rooms do after someone brave has spoken in them. She unlocked it just to see, and a little winter air came in, polite as a neighbor with a pie. Upstairs, a floorboard answered another floorboard like cousins across a long table. Her mother padded in, hair flattened on one side from a useful nap. She looked at the ribbon and smiled, confusion and acceptance shaking hands. "What's this?" "A reminder," Nina said, "in case we forget to open to the good things." She expected a laugh, maybe, or a "what a poet you are," but her mother only touched the ribbon gently with her fingertips and nodded as if the idea had been sleeping in the house, waiting to be called by its name. Grandfather woke with a start, small enough to be elegant. "Back already?" he said, which is the kind of thing people say when they knew you didn't truly leave. His eyes found the sled and softened into something almost watery. I wondered if the root would remember you. It remembered everyone, Nina said, even the ones we hadn't met yet. Emil yawned hugely, and then closed his mouth with an apology. We left some wishes in the spruce, he said, and gave the crossing guard tiny skates for his pocket. He looked down, embarrassed by the size of his own delight, and then surrendered to it. We painted stars on the lake. Grandfather reached for the sled and ran his hand along the painted rails. Where the Alder Street scene was, it had changed again. Now, very small and very clear, there was the picture of this room. A tree, a chair, a blanket on a lap. 2 children by a door with a ribbon the shape of a welcome. Nina felt the lovely vertigo of being seen accurately by something made with patience. You can take it again, Grandfather said. The root doesn't close. It just waits for snow that knows your name. He looked at the door. And for doors to remember their job. They set the sled by the wall where it could watch the night like a friendly dog. Nina's pockets were lighter now, the way hands are after they set down exactly the right weight. She wanted to lie under the tree and look up through the branches the way she had as a smaller child, back when the world was mostly ceilings full of blinking lights and grown-ups' knees. She wanted to tell someone all the details while also keeping them as a secret she could unwrap in quiet moments like the inside of a seashell. Both wishes could be true at once. Snow went on falling, thorough and kind. Somewhere down the block, Mr. Lanning's porch light shifted mood by a degree and made a stranger smile. The bakery's wish tree gathered another ornament. Come in if you're lonely. We have toast. The lake kept its stars alive just a little longer than anyone knew to expect, because the sky, busy as it was, had checked its pocket and found time for them after all. Morning. Christmas morning in Alder Street arrived on tiptoe so as not to wake anyone already happy. Nina came down in her slippers to find Emil asleep on the rug, hat over his eyes, the sled's rail under his hand, as if he were holding a railing in a moving train. Her mother was at the stove, stirring something golden, humming a song that had lived in the house even before the house learned its address. Grandfather sat at the table writing names on the back of old photographs with a pen that never gave up. There were presents, but they felt like punctuation to a sentence that had already been spoken well. Nina opened a small box and found the 3 ornament hooks from the market, now decorated by wishes that had done their work and become keepsakes. We laughed, we called, we forgave. Emil's matchbox of courage was missing because perhaps courage works best when it can't be weighed beforehand. In its place was a note in the small brush hand. Used properly, replacements are earned in the usual way. They walked to the window. The town wore its snow like a brand new memory. People were out already, not in a hurry, carrying casserole dishes and old stories. A neighbor waved, and instead of the usual polite triangle of hand and face and street, someone came up the steps without waiting to be asked. The door opened quite easily. The paper ribbon lifted in the draft and then settled back, pleased with its work. They ate together, and after breakfast, Nina and Emil bundled back into their coats because there were still deliveries to make that weren't on any painted rail, like taking Mrs. Bell a slice of the cake shaped like a wreath and dropping off oranges to the custodian and telling the lake quietly that its stars had looked very good in the night. Children pulled sleds up the hill and held them at the top long enough to share instructions only children can give each other. Everywhere, someone was opening their door with the patience of a person expecting someone specific. On the way home, they passed the spruce in front of the bakery. The wish ornaments had made themselves into a necklace of sentences that you could wear just by standing under it. Stay a little. take the last cookie. Tell me about your morning. We can try again. I'll walk you home. Back at the house, Grandfather had polished the runners once more and set the sled so the painted alder street faced the room. The scene had changed again, not the content, but the light. It now looked like the moment after someone had said, "I'm glad you're here," and meant it. He tapped the tiny tree with his finger. "See? It always adds what the room is full of." "What is it full of?" Emil asked, only half teasing. "Proof," Grandfather said. "The kind you can eat for breakfast." They laughed, and then were quiet and listened to the kind of quiet that contains a heartbeat. From the street came the ordinary noises of Christmas, doors closing gently, laughter bumping into corners, a dog learning the rules of a new sweater. The day expanded like bread rising without hurry, exactly as it should, again. That night, after the dishes had dried themselves by being left alone, after the tree had accepted one more paper chain, after the house had learned the names of the new toys, Nina and Emil took the sled back out. The snow had become the kind that squeaks under boots as if trying not to laugh. The sky showed more stars than yesterday, perhaps because it felt trusted. They pushed off and found the groove. The peppermint trees chimed hello like old friends calling to the porch. The market applauded without hands. At the lake, the painted stars from last night lay under the ice, like coins at the bottom of a fountain that does not ask you to pay again. The fisherman lifted his cap. The other Emil waved from the far shore, without needing to be closer to be understood. They didn't deliver anything this time. They only crossed the painted scenes and let the sled show what it had learned. On the rail, the Alder Street miniature now included Mrs. Bell holding a paper envelope against her heart, Mr. Lanning's porch with the new gentleness in its light, the crossing guard with his dime skates, the wish tree wearing manners like jewelry, and there, incredibly small, and somehow the center, the paper ribbon on their door. They glided to a stop at the top of Alder. The town lay below, all roofs and hope. Nina pressed her hand to the rail and felt the small warmth that meant the sled had added something else to the painting. She looked and found it. A new tiny scene tucked along the curve of the runner. Herself and Emil sitting at the top of the hill, holding a promise between them like a secret lantern. Not a lantern. A glow that needed no wick. The kind you carry when the world has decided to trust you with it. "What does it add next?" Emil asked. "What we do," Nina said, and the answer made them both very quiet and very brave. They slid home. The door opened. The ribbon lifted and settled, like a good sentence finding its period. Grandfather had left 2 mugs by the stove, and the cocoa tasted like the forest's bench, and the lake's stars, and the market's laughter, and the long, soft way the house held the night. Before bed, Nina stood at the window and looked at Alder Street, reading the faces of its people, saying nothing, telling everything. She thought about gifts that knew their names. She thought about how the sled had seemed to know where to go, and about the feeling in her hands when she touched the rail and felt the truth there. Maybe it wasn't that the sled knew. Maybe the town did. Maybe she did too. She whispered the refrain because good refrains are promises you keep out loud. The sled knew where it was going, even if Nina did not. If you listen closely next Christmas Eve as snow accepts the roofs and windows, you might hear what they heard that year. Runners on forgiving snow, laughter carrying a little farther than necessary, and somewhere very close the sound of a door remembering how